From the archives of the Midnight Society, we present a story of inherited dread. It comes from the journal of a young man who received a strange inheritance from his estranged grandfather, a master cartographer. He inherited a single hand-drawn map. He believed it was a work of art. He was wrong. It was a hunting ground. This is the story of a man who watched his own doom being written, one drop of ink at a time. My grandfather was a man I barely knew. He was a cartographer, a map maker, who became a recluse in his final years, shutting himself away in a remote house on the coast. When he passed, I was his only living relative, and his lawyer sent me the single small crate that contained all he had left behind. I expected old books, maybe a few surveying tools. I certainly didn't expect a curse. Inside the box, under layers of yellowed newspaper, was a rolled-up piece of parchment, sealed with a brittle wax stamp. It felt cold to the touch, a deep, unnatural cold that seemed to cling to my fingertips. It was heavy, far heavier than it should have been. It felt full. I thought it was just the weight of history. It was a map, but of no place I had ever seen. The coastline was wrong. The landmarks were poetic and strange. It was drawn with the breathtaking precision of a master, every line perfect, every detail exquisite. I assumed it was a work of fiction, a fantasy map from one of his favorite books, or perhaps one he'd created himself. There were dozens of faded brown lines crisscrossing it, connecting the strange landmarks. They seemed to mark old journeys, forgotten paths. I spent an hour just admiring it, a final, beautiful piece of my grandfather's forgotten genius. It was a piece of art. At that point, I saw nothing sinister about it at all. The paper was clean. The lines were set. It was a finished work. I left it on the table to flatten out under some books. Later that evening, as I was making coffee, I glanced at it again, and I saw something that made me stop. A dot, a tiny, perfect blood-red dot, right next to the landmark labeled the Weeping Willow. It hadn't been there before. I was absolutely certain of it. I leaned in closer. The ink was glistening. It looked wet. I touched the edge of it with a fingernail, but it was dry. I brushed at it, thinking it was a speck of dust, a crumb, anything, but it was part of the map. I felt a prickle of unease, but my logical mind took over. It was an old document, a chemical reaction, a flaw in the paper, the ink oxidizing. There were 100 rational explanations. I chose to believe one of them. But it bothered me. The name, the Weeping Willow. It was so specific. On a whim, I searched the name of my grandfather's town and Weeping Willow in the local newspaper's digital archives. I found it almost instantly. An article from 50 years ago. A 10-year-old boy had fallen from the branches of a massive ancient willow tree on the edge of town while playing. It was a local tragedy that had been a town legend for decades. The location described in the article was the exact spot marked on my grandfather's map. A cold dread began to seep into me. This wasn't a fantasy map. It was a map of real places, and that red dot wasn't a flaw in the paper. It was a marker for a tragedy. I felt a sudden, powerful urge to look at the map again. I turned on the light over the table and stared at it. My heart hammered against my ribs. It had changed. The red dot was no longer a dot. A line, thin and sharp as a razor cut, was now extending from it, crawling across the paper towards another landmark, Miller's Crossing. The ink at its leading edge was a deep, wet crimson, as if it had been drawn just a second ago. I didn't touch it this time. I knew it was real. This was impossible. This was madness. With trembling hands, I went back to my laptop and searched for Miller's Crossing and accident. And there it was, a news alert posted only 10 minutes ago. A fatal 2-car collision on the old bridge at Miller's Crossing. The map wasn't just marking the past. It was marking death as it happened. And the line was still moving. My mind, the rational, academic part of me, was screaming for an explanation. It had to be a trick, a complex chemical reaction in the ink, triggered by changes in air pressure or humidity. I tried to reason it away, to build a wall of logic against the encroaching madness. But the older part of my brain, the part that remembers being afraid of the dark, knew exactly what it was seeing. It was a living thing, a predator that moved in inches, not miles. I didn't eat, I didn't sleep for the next 36 hours. I just sat there, at my table, and I watched. I watched as drop by agonizing drop, the red line extended itself across the paper. It was a crawl, a horrifyingly slow and deliberate crawl. It was the pace of something that knows its prey has nowhere left to run. The world outside, the sounds of traffic, the lives of my neighbors, all of it faded away into a distant hum. My entire universe had shrunk to this single piece of paper and the terrible creeping wound that was growing upon it. I couldn't just watch. I had to understand. I went back to the old wooden box, the source of this nightmare. I ran my hands over every inch of it, searching for anything my grandfather might have left. A clue, a warning, and I found it. A false bottom. Tucked away beneath a thin layer of wood was a small leather-bound journal. His journal. I opened it, and the pages were filled with his handwriting, not the precise, elegant script of a cartographer, but a frantic, mad scrawl, the words practically clawing their way off the page. The last entry was dated the day before he died. I read it, and the cold in the room became a physical presence. "The map is not a record," he wrote. "It is a parasite. It is an artist that paints only in tragedy. It feeds on sorrow, drawn to the echoes of grief like a moth to a flame. But it is a hungry thing, and when it can find no old sorrows to trace, it makes its own. It will find a new subject. It will anchor itself to a fresh source of pain. I have tried to burn it, to sink it, but it always returns. It is not on the paper. The paper is just the window through which it looks. The curse is in the knowing. God forgive me, I have led it to my own family." His last words filled me with a new, terrible kind of hope. It is drawn to the echoes of grief. His journal spoke of other places, places of immense ancient sorrow that he had dared not mark for fear of waking them. One was an old abandoned chapel where a fire had claimed an entire congregation a century ago. The silent chapel. I thought, if I could just lead it there, if I could offer it a greater tragedy than my own simple life, maybe it would change its focus. Maybe I could divert its attention, offer it a new meal, a more satisfying hunt. It was a fool's hope, I know, a scientist's prayer in the face of the abyss. I drove for hours following the faded brown lines on the map itself, the car's GPS completely useless. I found the ruins, a skeleton of a building swallowed by ivy, the air thick with a forgotten sadness. I stood before it, my heart pounding, and I unfolded the map, waiting for it to feast on this place, waiting for the red line to sprout from the chapel's location and leave me be. I stood in the cold wind for what felt like an eternity, waiting for a new red line to sprout from the chapel's location on the paper. But nothing happened. The map remained still, and then a new kind of cold washed over me, a feeling that had nothing to do with the wind. It was the feeling of being watched, a focused, malevolent attention. I lowered my eyes, my gaze shifting from the chapel's mark, across the yellowed continent of parchment, back to my own home. And there it was, a fresh wound on the paper, a single perfect blood-red dot, appearing as I watched, pulsing softly with a wet crimson light, right on top of the little square my grandfather had labeled home. The map had ignored the feast of old death I had offered it. It wasn't interested in old ghosts. It had anchored itself to me. It had found a fresh source of sorrow. It had found its next subject. I drove home in a blind panic, breaking every speed limit, as if I could outrun the truth. But when I burst into my apartment, it was already there, waiting for me on the table, and the line had already begun. It wasn't fast. It moved at a horrifying, deliberate crawl, the wet ink glistening under my dining room light, an inch an hour, a thin, wet trail of my own fate being drawn before my eyes. I thought about running, fleeing the city, changing my name, but my grandfather's words echoed in my head. The curse is in the knowing. The map didn't need to track me. It knew where I was. I thought about burning it, tearing it to shreds, but I knew it was useless. You cannot burn a shadow. The map wasn't the curse. It was just the illustration of it. The red line was no longer a mystery to be solved. It was a sentence being carried out, and I was just a prisoner, watching the walls of my own execution chamber being drawn around me. I had to stop it. I couldn't let it reach its destination. For hours I tried everything my terrified, frantic mind could conjure. I read online about curses and folk magic. I poured a thick line of salt across the parchment, a desperate pagan ward against evil. The red ink approached it, paused for a moment as if considering it, and then simply flowed over the salt, leaving a clean crimson trail through the white crystals. I tried to dilute it, placing a single drop of water in its path. The ink refused to mix, splitting and flowing around the droplet before rejoining on the other side. My final pathetic attempt was to create a physical barrier. I took my grandfather's old letter opener and tried to carve a trench into the thick ancient paper. I thought if I could break the path, I could break the spell. But as the blade cut into the parchment, the map itself seemed to resist, the paper becoming as hard as stone under the knife's edge. It was useless. Every attempt was useless. You can't fight a thing that isn't bound by physical laws. You can't outrun a curse that's already in your house. I finally knew where it was going. The red line had crossed the tiny hand-drawn blueprint of my apartment. It had passed the kitchen, bypassed the living room, and was now crawling with agonizing slowness towards the far wall of my study. Its destination was a small square my grandfather had marked on the map with a faded brown ink X. I followed its projected path with my eyes across the room to the wall above my desk, and my heart turned to lead. It was pointing to the only thing of his I had ever displayed, a single framed photograph of my grandfather, taken a year before he died. His eyes, even in the old faded picture, were a vortex of terror and intellect, staring out at the world with a warning I had never understood. The map wasn't leading to a place. It was leading to him, to the source. It was closing a loop that had been open for decades, and it was using me as the final, connecting thread. The line was almost there. It was almost time. The ink touched the X. A faint, almost inaudible hum filled the room, a low, resonant note of pure sorrow. I looked up at the photograph on the wall, and I screamed. He moved. In the photograph, his head, which had been facing forward for years, slowly, impossibly turned. His wild, haunted eyes, once staring into the distance, were now fixed on me. They were filled with an expression of both profound pity and horrifying admonishment. The air in the room grew thick, heavy with the smell of old paper and the sea. The walls of my modern apartment seemed to thin, and for a moment I could almost see the dark wood-paneled study of his coastal home through them. I felt my own memories beginning to blur, my own history becoming thin and transparent. The map wasn't just marking sorrow, it was a gateway. It was overriding my reality with his. I was no longer in my apartment, I was in his study, and I was not alone. I'm forgetting my name, Ethan. It feels thin, like a word from a book I read a long time ago. I can feel his memories, the taste of salt in the air, the endless scratching of a pen on parchment, the fear, oh God, the constant crippling fear of the ink. He didn't run from the world. He was trying to outrun the map. He failed, and now I have. I am recording this with the last of my own thoughts. I am looking at the map. The red line is gone. It's brown now, faded, a part of the permanent history of this place. But the label, my home, it's been renamed. It now reads the cartographer's final study. I have become a place, a destination for future sorrow. The curse is not in the map, it's in the bloodline, and the line has reached its end. Ethan's journal was found on the table next to the map in his abandoned apartment. His last entry was a single, repeated phrase, "I am a place." Authorities found no sign of him. The new owners of the apartment often complain of a profound, inexplicable sadness in the study and the persistent faint smell of the sea. The map was logged into our archives. It shows no sign of the blood-red ink described in Ethan's testimony. It is a beautiful, inert, and harmless-looking artifact. But we know its secret. It is not a record of tragedy. It is a seed, and it is merely waiting patiently for a new hand to unroll it and a new home to be drawn upon its surface. The archives of the Midnight Society are now closed,